Sup, Chooms? Kept y'all waiting, didn't I? Well, Chooms, I know the reason why you all watch this channel. It is for learning the art of hair loss witchery. Our work here is far too important for any kind of distractions, but sometimes, before I can get to the content I actually enjoy creating, I have to take out the garbage too. So let's go ahead and begin. So, big surprise, Chooms. I'm under attack from a DHT simp. It's this prick right here. I'm not even going to mention the name of his channel since I think he's attacking me to market his business, and since I don't know his name, I'm going to have to assign him a more appropriate moniker. Since I know virtually nothing about this fine fellow, let's go to his website and see how he defines himself. Let's see. So apparently he's a grade A medical student and almost a doctor. Okay, that'll do. Henceforth he shall be known as Almost a Doctor. But do I really want to respond to Almost a Doctor? I mean, there are far bigger channels out there that are simping for DHT, and this guy barely has more than 500 subscribers, so maybe I should just leave him be and focus on bigger fish.
This fucking clown hair cafe. You are a fucking idiot, and that goes to the hair cafe idiot as well. And I think it's just because he's stupid.
You know what? I changed my mind. Fuck this guy. Let's put him to the fire. I can't tolerate this kind of verbal abuse. I hold my channel to a much higher standard, and I would never barrage anyone I disagreed with any kind of personal attacks. In any case, what he certainly is a grade A asshole because your content sucks. So if nothing else works, let's just start doing fecal transplants, and this is all appropriate because this whole podcast is frankly a fecal transplant, and nothing leaves a worse impression than when someone sees a person who has a shaved ring of hair that looks like a toilet seat around their head, which is appropriate because in this day of age, you have got to have shit for brains to let yourself go bald. Okay, well maybe there was that one time, but to be fair, they usually went after me first like this guy is doing here. So anyways, in addition to being almost a doctor, he's also a self-described biohacker. I've dealt with plenty of biohackers before, and one thing I've noticed that they all have in common is that they're absolute experts when it comes to flashing studies on screen and then subsequently drawing conclusions that aren't actually warranted, or they're based on an inaccurate interpretation of the research, or they take the research out of context in order to push an agenda or their business. The difference between a biohacker and a hair loss witcher like myself is a hair loss witcher actually knows how to interpret research, while a biohacker like this guy only knows how to find whatever study confirms their biases and then treat it like it's gospel. It's funny how every biohacker on YouTube is such an absolute huge DHT simp, since if you really think about it, finasteride is the ultimate biohacking drug out there. It not only stops hair loss, but it prevents prostate enlargement and improves skin health. It reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease, it improves your mental health, reduces your risk of cancer, and that's just scraping the surface here, chums. Finasteride is the absolute best tool if you want to hack your biology, and it sure as hell is a lot more useful than the pseudo-nootropic bullshit supplements you see most biohackers push these days, and I made videos about all of finasteride's benefits outside of just hair loss, and I'll link those videos all below. So let's see what Almost a Doctor has to say about why finasteride is so bad and why DHT is so great. So the title of his video is, quote, "The Brain on Finasteride, Dutasteride, Neurosteroids, Dementia Risk, Side Effects, PFS," unquote. But my neurosteroids! I've heard all this bullshit a million times already before, and I guarantee you that I've already debunked it in previous videos. I can assure all of you hair loss witchers that there is not going to be a single piece of research he's going to present that I haven't already addressed many times before. So it's especially strange that Almost a Doctor is so incredibly pissed off at me. If he had just bothered to actually watch my content, he'd have seen that everything he's going over is research I have already covered in depth. Yet, he's presenting this video like I'm ignoring all this research in order to push a pro-finasteride agenda. But fine, whatever. Let's get this over with and show where Almost a Doctor almost knows how to interpret research, but fails miserably.
Why do people feel brain fog, depressed, anxious, lost in libido?
His content is so bad that even his own video is laughing at him. It looks like he does have a name though, it's Ali, but I have to be honest, Almost a Doctor has a much better ring to it, so that's what I'm going to continue calling him.
Now I'll start with the juicy intro, which is that both finasteride and dutasteride were linked to a higher risk of all-cause dementia, vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and depression. Now the risk for depression was constant over time, but it wasn't constant for vascular dementia, all-cause dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. So with prolonged exposure over time, the risk did decrease, and the authors hypothesized that this means the risk is clinically insignificant, but I hypothesize not everybody's wired the same neurologically, and people have different life conditions, different stressors, different neurological wiring, different androgen sensitivity in their brains, so on and so forth, and I'm going to prove all of that in this video.
The first study he brings up is this study here titled, quote, Association of 5A reductase inhibitors with dementia, depression, and suicide, unquote. Now, I believe this is a study I covered in my nutrition library response video, so I'll go ahead and link that below, and maybe I've covered it in some other videos as well. But anyways, paraphrasing Almost a Doctor, he says that the risk of depression was constant over time on finasteride and dutasteride, but the risk of dementia actually decreased over time on those drugs. Almost a Doctor almost completely misinterprets the conclusions of this study. Even though the risk of dementia actually decreased the longer people were on finasteride or dutasteride in this study, Almost a Doctor draws the complete opposite conclusion. Specifically, he thinks these drugs make dementia worse. So, what is his reasoning? It's because everybody is different.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
So Almost a Doctor is completely throwing away the conclusions of this very first study he presents. Of course, this is probably just a tiny little study, so that's understandable. So let's go ahead and see. Yes, this study is based on a sample size of a meager, paltry, negligible, and incredibly small number of just 2,236,876 men. So he's twisting the results of this study to support his own biases. Almost a Doctor, why do you reject the conclusions of this huge study and then later on accept without any skepticism whatsoever the results of some PFS network funded study with just 7 subjects? You can't make this shit up. Could it be because people believing in post-finasteride syndrome is more agreeable with the financial objectives of your channel? We'll get into all that a bit later, but in this video, Almost a Doctor has the balls to accuse me of being stupid and spreading misinformation.
This guy has a pretty respectable platform and he's using it to spread misinformation.
Yet you have the audacity to pull off shit like this?
Come on.
In fact, the authors actually conclude the opposite of what Almost a Doctor says. They say, quote, both finasteride and dutasteride do not seem to be associated with an increased risk for all-cause dementia, Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, or suicide, unquote. Also, they say, quote, the lack of an association between 5A inhibitors and dementia is broadly consistent with the results of other studies in this area in which a lack of an association between androgens and cognition was seen, unquote. Well, what about the risk of depression in this study that Almost a Doctor mentions? Isn't that kind of a big deal? Well, first of all, it's very important to realize that this was a retrospective database study that looked at men 50 to 90 years old. Most of these men were taking finasteride and dutasteride for prostate problems. In the study, these men were compared to men who were taking alpha-blocking drugs like tamsulosin, as well as men on none of those drugs. Well, no surprise, men taking any of those drugs, whether it was finasteride, dutasteride, or alpha blockers, all had a higher risk of depression than men taking none of these drugs. And in fact, men taking alpha blocking drugs had the highest risk of depression of all, even though alpha blocking drugs do not affect DHT or neurosteroids whatsoever. So, if 5A inhibiting drugs cause depression, why would a drug that doesn't inhibit the 5A enzyme cause even more depression? Well, it's because there are other explanations for depression in the study other than blaming it on taking 5A inhibiting drugs. First of all, as you can see from the bottom portion of this graph, the difference in the incidence of depression is very slight. And as you can also see here, men taking 5A blockers were more likely to have other diseases which could lead to depression. They were also more likely to be on beta blockers, which have a side effect of depression. Even in elementary school, I was taught that correlation does not equal causation. I hope to God that Almost a Doctor ever setting foot in a medical school is just him trolling us. There is no reason to conclude from the study that 5A blockers directly cause depression, and I talk about all this in my video on 5A blockers and depression that I'll link below.
I'm going to prove all of that in this video by discussing the role of DHT in the brain, the role of 3 other neurosteroids in the brain, and another shocking function of 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, which I don't believe anybody has discussed on YouTube. So how do these drugs work? Finasteride inhibits the second and third subtypes of 5-alpha reductase, while dutasteride inhibits subtypes 1, 2, and 3. So dutasteride is also going to inhibit the conversion of progesterone into allopregnanolone, and I'm going to discuss that in this video later on, so keep that in mind. But the important thing to know is 5-alpha reductase doesn't just 5-alpha reduce testosterone into DHT. It's involved in the synthesis of other molecules, but I'm not going to discuss those today. I'm simply going to focus on DHT and 2 of its metabolites and Allopregnanolone, which is inhibited by dutasteride. All 3 of these are neurosteroids.
Okay, this guy's jump cuts are starting to give me a seizure here. I understand, I have to do edits too a lot of times, but can this guy speak even 2 sentences without taking a stumble? What he says about the 5-AR enzyme playing other roles in the body is true, but it is misleading, and there are a lot of subtleties involved in the research that likely go over almost a doctor's head. Fortunately, I do have a great video that goes in depth about the role of all the 5-AR isoenzymes, and actually, there are 5 of them, not just 3. I've done more research on this subject than anyone else on YouTube, and perhaps anyone else in existence. There is literally no better source of information on the 5-AR isoenzymes than the information you can find here on this channel, so you're welcome for that one, chums. But what is important to know is that neither finasteride nor dutasteride inhibit the 5-AR enzymes in a way that would cause any sort of clinical problems for human beings. And I have the research which proves all this, so please check out the video if you're interested in learning more about that. Alright, please continue, Almost a Doctor.
In addition, I'm going to prove that post-finasteride syndrome is real. It's not an imagined condition like this fucking clown hair cafe says. And yeah, let's start.
Yes, it is imaginary. It is just as imaginary as your medical background, biohacker. You say in the description of your channel that you're inspired by Leo and longevity. I can kind of see the similarities, but only if you remove the charisma, intelligence, temperament, good looks, and likability that Leo had. Leo, God rest his soul, was confident enough in his abilities and his arguments that he didn't need to personally attack people in order to make a point, and that's because he wasn't an intellectual dilettante like you are. I actually did a response to one of Leo's videos before he died, which I'll link below, and even though I don't really agree with the points he was making in that video, I never personally attacked him because I respected his intelligence since he knew how to make compelling, scientifically grounded arguments. You lack Leo's talent for producing quality, informative content, and that is why you're trying to compensate for your lack of intelligence with ad hominem attacks against me. Truth be told, I really don't care about how you choose to present yourself, but please stop disrespecting Leo's memory and remove his name from your channel's description because you don't deserve it. And I say that as someone who is a fan of Leo and as someone who defended him back when a bunch of pussies tried canceling him over shit that was none of their business a couple of years ago.
So I'll start with DHT. Now here's a paper that studied the effects of testosterone and dihydrotestosterone on the formation of neuron dendritic spines in rats. So it was found that testosterone consistently mostly increased the densities of dendritic spines with smaller heads, while DHT was specifically mostly involved in increasing the densities of dendritic spines with medium to large heads. So DHT seems to have a very specific role in neuroplasticity in our brains. And keep in mind, this study was done in the rat hippocampus, which is the memory center of your brain. So to put it simply, and if DHT increased the densities of another type of dendritic spine than testosterone, then yes, both of them are crucial for neuroplasticity, but DHT seems to have its own specific role when it comes to neuroplasticity and the formation of new connections between neurons.
So in this study, Almost a Doctor tries to make the point that DHT is crucial for brain neuroplasticity. So before we analyze the study and the other subsequent studies he lays out, let me point out the common mistakes that Almost a Doctor and pretty much almost all other DHT simps when they make their arguments. First of all, these DHT simps don't distinguish between the roles of DHT in embryonic development and in puberty versus the role DHT plays in adulthood. Literally nobody, not even me, is claiming that DHT is a trash hormone in development and during puberty. The question here is the role of DHT in adulthood, where there is no doubt that it is a trash hormone that only has harmful effects like hair loss, acne, and prostate enlargement. This isn't even a controversial opinion here, chums. It is actually the mainstream belief in the medical industry. Second, as we'll soon see, Almost a Doctor and other DHT simps rely almost completely on animal studies, specifically rodent studies, in order to make their points about the effects of finasteride on the behavior and cognitive functions in human beings. The reason why you cannot extrapolate rodent data to human beings when it comes to finasteride is that in humans, finasteride is a very strong blocker of the type 2 5-AR isoenzyme and only has a negligible effect on the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme. Dutasteride is 100 times stronger at blocking the type 1 5-air isoenzyme than finasteride is, but despite this fact, dutasteride still has about the same side effect profile as finasteride does. This may have to do with the fact that dutasteride is a larger molecule than finasteride and so may not cross through the blood-brain barrier into the brain, but the point I'm trying to make here is that finasteride in human beings is a very, very weak type 1 5-air isoenzyme blocker, which is completely different from how the drug works in rodents. The reason this is very important is because in rodents, unlike in human beings, finasteride is a very strong blocker of the type 1 5-air isoenzyme. So finasteride in rodents is almost like a different drug than it is in humans. And the reason that is so incredibly important is because it is the type 1 isoenzyme that is predominant in the brain. It is specifically the type 1 isoenzyme that forms the neurosteroid called Allopregnanolone in the brain. Dr. Steckbroke back in 2001 showed in a scientific experiment that a compound called MK386, which is a pure type 1 5-air blocker, could completely eliminate all 5-air activity in human brain tissue, suggesting very strongly that the only 5-air isoenzyme in the brain is the type 1 isoenzyme. If we look at very sensitive assays, then we can see that very tiny amounts of the type 2 5-air isoenzyme can be found in the brain, but we know this has to be negligible because, as I just showed you all, a pure type 1 5-air blocker can completely knock out 5-air enzyme activity in the brain. Completely. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the effects of finasteride on rat brains cannot be extrapolated to human brains, and this is a point that all DHT simps, including Almost a Doctor, are never able to figure out. So, as if that weren't bad enough, another critical flaw of these rodent studies is that they use mega doses of finasteride on a weight basis, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of times higher than the equivalent dose in a human being. Now, I know you can't just simply extrapolate doses purely on weight in rodent studies, but even factoring weight in, we are still looking at doses at least dozens of times higher than normal human doses. Finally, in many studies, including human studies, DHT is used instead of testosterone in order to test for androgen-like effects. The reason for this is that although both DHT and testosterone stimulate the same androgen receptor, testosterone is not a pure androgen since it can be metabolized by the aromatase enzyme into estradiol. So, in a castrated rat study, for example, investigators will often use DHT as the androgen of choice instead of testosterone when they want to test for androgen effects. Researchers do this in order to avoid the complication that giving testosterone can also increase estrogen levels, and the results are then going to reflect a mixture of androgen effects and estrogen effects. So speaking in the context of a research subject, if you want to isolate the effects of androgens, it is actually better to use DHT than testosterone. So for research purposes, DHT is not a trash hormone, I'll admit. In castrated rat studies where the effects of DHT are examined, it is incorrect to draw the conclusion that DHT has some special effect different from testosterone. Both drugs are androgens. DHT is more potent, but it is a paracrine hormone that acts locally. When it is given systemically, though, in high doses, it will act as a potent androgen, but that isn't a reflection of its physiologic role as it is produced naturally in the human body. These are points I have made many times already, so let's keep them in mind as we look at the multitude of studies that Almost a Doctor gish gallops through. So, the first study is on the effects of DHT and testosterone on neurons in the hippocampus of rats. Almost a Doctor claims that DHT and testosterone had different effects on neuroplasticity. Like Almost a Doctor explains, the study looked at the growth of connections in neurons stimulated by androgens. These connections are formed by little buds that grow on the neurons called spines. This is a study where DHT was used experimentally purely to avoid the aromatization effects of testosterone. It does not prove that DHT is important for neuroplasticity, as Almost a Doctor likes to claim. As the authors of the study explain, the different effects are probably just related to the different androgenic potency of testosterone versus DHT. Even though normal DHT levels in the blood are 10 times lower than testosterone levels, in this experiment, the investigators used the same concentration of DHT and testosterone, specifically 10 nanomoles. So right away, this is research that cannot be extrapolated to people since it is using doses of DHT that cannot possibly be reached through natural production in the human body. Despite this, what the investigators found was that the overall effects of testosterone testosterone and DHT on spine density were similar and were all mediated by the stimulation of the androgen receptor. The testosterone effect was not blocked when finasteride or an aromatase inhibitor was given. This implies that the conversion of testosterone into DHT or into estrogen was not a necessary factor for spine growth. Testosterone can do it all by itself, rendering DHT completely useless. The authors note that the different size spines seen with testosterone and DHT may simply be related to the more potent effects of DHT versus testosterone when given systemically. What this means is that DHT does not have any specific role different from testosterone. It just means that androgens are important for brain function, and nobody doubts that, but there is nothing that DHT can do that testosterone can't already do. Both DHT and testosterone interact with the exact same androgen receptors, and both can fulfill the exact same roles in neuroplasticity. So as long as you are producing testosterone, there's not going to be any problem here.
So this study used SAMP8 mice, which are mouse models prone to Alzheimer's disease and rapid aging. And what this study found was that DHT had significant effects on modulating and maintaining synaptic plasticity. So what they did was they took SAM8 mice, they divided them into 3 groups. One group was a control group. The second group was a castration group where the mice were castrated. The third group was a castration plus DHT group. So the results were that the mice in the castration group had rapid acceleration of their cognitive decline, while the mice in the control obviously were just the control, while the mice that were given DHT as a treatment, they had similar results to the control in terms of attenuating their cognitive decline and maintaining neuronal plasticity in their hippocampus. So this speaks to another profound effect of neuroprotection done by DHT alone. And in this study, testosterone was not used. It was just DHT.
So here is the study on neuroplasticity in the hippocampus of mildly cognitively impaired castrated mice. This is an example of a study where clearly DHT was used in castrated mice just in order to avoid the aromatization effects seen with testosterone. So Almost a Doctor is once again just jumping to the conclusion that DHT's role in this research is specific to DHT, when in reality it would be testosterone that would be fulfilling this role effectively if it were being produced naturally, which it obviously isn't since we're dealing with castrated mice. In fact, the investigators state that their results are consistent with their previous findings that both testosterone and DHT improve cognitive behavior in castrated rats and mice, suggesting that it is androgens that are important, not DHT specifically. Once again, I stress that DHT can fulfill the role of testosterone when it is supplemented, but in healthy adults, there is no beneficial role that DHT plays specifically. It only does bad things, hence why it is a trash hormone. We don't even see this in just mice. DHT can be used as a testosterone replacement analog in humans too. This doesn't prove that DHT has any isolated beneficial effects separate from testosterone. It just proves that androgens in general are important for neural function. If these mice were castrated and then given testosterone, the exact same results would have happened. It's just that DHT is preferred for research purposes since the researchers don't have to worry about DHT aromatizing into estrogen since it can't.
In addition, I'd like to discuss this paper which studied the differential effects of gonadal steroids on dopamine metabolism in the nigrostriatal pathway and the mesolimbic pathway. So basically, gonadal steroids that were studied here were testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and estradiol. So what they found was each of these gonadal steroids facilitated sexual behavior and expression of sexual behavior in mice via enhancing the functional activity of dopaminergic neurons. So maybe that means that in a lot of individuals, your testosterone and estradiol can pick up the slack, but it's not the case in everybody. Because, like I said, not everybody can be put into the same box. Not everybody has the same environmental stressors, and especially not everybody has the same neurological wiring. That is a fact.
Well, Almost a Doctor doesn't say much about this study from 1981, so he just goes back to his theory that not everyone fits into the same box. Okay, cool story, bro, but that doesn't relieve you of your responsibility to back up your bullshit with actual fucking evidence. If you want to claim that lifestyle plays a role in how well people tolerate finasteride, the burden of proof is on you. Just saying something like, oh, not everyone fits in the same box, that's just pure speculation on your part. The clinical clinical trials of finasteride included subjects of all different backgrounds, so some of them could have been elite athletes, while others could have been lazy couch potatoes. The bottom line from the research here, though, chooms, is that the incidence of side effects was only about 2% higher than placebo, and there was no evidence of any persistent side effects whatsoever. Anyways, the study he is quoting is an old study using an outdated methodology, but it basically shows that castration causes low dopamine levels in rat brains. This effect is reversed by giving either testosterone, DHT, or even estrogen. So there is nothing in the study that shows that DHT specifically is essential to maintain dopamine levels in the rat brain. All it proves is that DHT can effectively fulfill the role of testosterone in the absence of testosterone. So unless you are hypogonadal or castrated or Jason Blaha, none of this data pertains to you, and even if it did, you could supplement with testosterone instead of DHT, which would of course be preferable since testosterone doesn't cause hair loss or an enlarged prostate.
And here's a study showing the neuroprotective effects of DHT by attenuating neuroinflammation induced by lipopolysaccharide in mice. So lipopolysaccharide is a type of bacterial toxin, and the neuroinflammation is going to cause over time necrosis in neurons and neurotoxicity, and DHT was able to attenuate that.
So he briefly mentions this study here. It's yet another castrated mouse study that looks at the effects of androgens on neuroinflammation. This is just another example of a study using DHT instead of testosterone in order to avoid the confounding effects of testosterone with its ability to aromatize into estrogen. It's not like they compared testosterone and testosterone plus finasteride to see if DHT was really all that important. The investigators come to the conclusion that androgens are important, not DHT specifically. I mean, this is getting really repetitive at this point, but this study has the exact same limitation as the last two he cited. The researchers are using supplemental DHT to reach their conclusions. Almost a doctor is extrapolating from that somehow this means DHT specifically is necessary for brain function. No, it isn't. Not even the researchers agree with him. The only valid conclusion that can possibly be drawn from the study is that androgens are needed for brain function, and it doesn't have to be DHT. Testosterone will do just fine.
So in the body, DHT is also metabolized into two different metabolites by 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, and respectively it's metabolized into 3-alpha androstenediol and 3-beta androstenediol. And I'll discuss both of these molecules and how they're different and unique in their own effects.
So he pronounces those hormones kind of weird, but he has a bit of an accent, so maybe English isn't his first language, so I won't give him any flack for that. But I guess the problem here is he's not getting very far in trying to prove that DHT is beneficial. So to confuse everyone even further, he starts talking about two metabolites of DHT, specifically 3-alpha androstenediol and 3-beta androstenediol. So okay, I guess we're done talking about DHT for now. So let's see what he has to say about these two metabolites instead.
So in this study, it was shown to have anticonvulsant effects in rats who were injected with pentyl and etrazole as well as picrotoxin, which are two very potent GABA-A receptor antagonists known for inducing clonic seizures in rats, and 3-alpha androstenediol had anticonvulsant effects against both of these molecules.
So he throws up on the screen for a few seconds this study here. It's a study showing that 3-alpha androstenediol has anti-seizure effects in mice. So almost a doctor is really grasping for straws here to convince you that finasteride is dangerous. Now to be fair, this study would be something to be concerned about if you were a mouse with epilepsy. So if you're watching this video and you are in fact a mouse with epilepsy, then please talk to your doctor about this before starting finasteride. That's very important. Don't worry, everything grows hair on mice, so I'm sure you'll find something to treat your hair loss. But for my actual human viewers watching this channel, it's important to keep in mind that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that finasteride increases the risk of seizures. To quote from this review article on neurosteroids and epilepsy, quote, "Similarly, there is no evidence that finasteride causes seizures in humans who do not have epilepsy. Finasteride is used clinically for the treatment of benign prostatic hypertrophy and male pattern hair loss. Seizures have not been reported as an adverse event of finasteride treatment, and given the long experience with the drug, it is safe to say that it does not cause epilepsy," unquote. On a personal note, I've been talking about hair loss on this channel for 10 years, and I have answered tens of thousands of questions, and not once, not even once, has anyone ever ask me about seizures. If it is a side effect, then it is a 1 in a million side effect. Even giving almost a doctor the benefit of the doubt here, it doesn't justify this level of pearl-clutching fear-mongering that he's presenting to his viewers. So, he then gives a couple of examples of other rodent studies that looked at 3-alpha and 3-beta androstenediol, but why does any of this even matter? We're not even talking about DHT anymore. We're talking about metabolites of DHT, and if we've already established that finasteride has no significant effect on the 5-AR enzyme in the human brain, then frankly, Chooms, I think we're getting pretty far off course here. These are just mere metabolites of DHT, and these brain effects wouldn't be seen in men anyways, even if they were important, because finasteride won't even affect DHT levels in the human brain to begin with, and that's because its effect on the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme is negligible. It doesn't matter. Remember, even dutasteride, which is 100 times more powerful than finasteride in blocking the type 1 isoenzyme, it still doesn't have any neurological side effects. So, if finasteride doesn't affect DHT in the brain, then it also won't affect downstream metabolites of DHT in the brain either. He then switches to the subject of prostate cancer.
Now, finasteride and dutasteride, taking them prophylactically, does reduce the risk of prostate cancer, but it does increase the risk of high-grade prostate cancer. So what they'll tell you is that this is because screening was improved, and diagnosing was improved because finasteride and dutasteride shrink the prostate. But how does that make sense if finasteride and dutasteride lower cancer rates, so cancer rates were lower in the finasteride and dutasteride group, but the rates of high-grade prostate cancer were increased in those groups as well? So there's something that doesn't make a lot of sense here, and I think the hypothesis is a little reachy. But maybe my logic is flawed. If you know how it works, just please let me know. I just want to learn, because to me this seems like absolute horseshit, but I'm very open-minded, so I'm open to be wrong about this one. Now, am I saying that overall they're a bad investment for cancers? No, they clearly reduce the risk of prostate cancer. That's a fact. But there's also an increase in the risk of high-grade prostate cancer, so it's not nothing. You know what I mean?
So he says he's open to being wrong, and I'm really going to test that because I don't believe him at all. If Almost a Doctor had done just a little bit more research, he would have seen this article published in the New England Journal of Medicine from 2019 that explains clearly the paradox that finasteride reduces cancer risk while at the same time it increases the detection of higher grade prostate cancer. The study looked at long-term follow-ups of subjects treated with finasteride versus placebo, and it showed that if anything, finasteride reduced the risk of death from prostate cancer. If finasteride actually increased the risk of more aggressive prostate cancers, the risk of death would increase, it wouldn't decrease. There's even more data on this, in fact. It turns out that 5-AR inhibitors, including both finasteride and dutasteride, reduce the risk of prostate cancer without increasing the risk of high-grade prostate cancer, such as this large prospective study of over 330,000 men from Sweden. In fact, this was a huge subject of discussion in my video where I reviewed Dr. Atiya's interview with that quack urologist, which I'll link below. As you can see, finasteride lowered the risk of all forms of prostate cancer except the very highest grade, but even in that case, it did not increase the risk of high-grade cancer. These more recent studies show that 5-AR inhibitors are safe in terms of prostate cancer risk and mortality. Because of this, there have even been calls for the FDA to remove the warning label about the increased risk of high-grade prostate cancer from taking 5-AR inhibiting drugs. And I agree with this move completely. Finasteride is good for the prostate. Any claim to the contrary is complete nonsense. But apparently Almost a Doctor missed out on this later research, or maybe, just maybe, we're seeing a little bit of selection bias going on here in this video.
And in this paper, 3-beta androstenediol regulated stress response and CRH levels in response to stress.
Okay, so after a brief detour, he's now back to more rat studies about 3-beta androstenediol, and this is getting pretty tedious at this point. I'd really only be repeating my last point if I responded to it, so let's not even bother with it. He hasn't even shown that DHT is affected by 5-AR inhibitors in the brain to any significant degree to begin with, so all these studies on 3-alpha and 3-beta androstenediol are really completely irrelevant. I don't mind him speculating about the mechanism, but he hasn't even proven that this mechanism applies to humans. Unless you are a rat, none of this matters at all.
So here's a study showing that 3-beta androstenediol increased the gene expression of oxytocin in the hypothalamus. Now, oxytocin is a hormone released by your posterior pituitary, but it is synthesized in your hypothalamus. So increasing the gene expression of oxytocin in your hypothalamus means you're going to have more oxytocin. And for males, it's very important because oxytocin not only modulates sexual behavior in males, it also contracts your vas deferens to eject sperm. But in addition, it was shown to have anxiolytic-like effects in simulated public speaking in humans. And oxytocin is a hormone that plays a role in social behavior and motivation.
So now he goes even one step further and says that 3-beta-androstenediol influences oxytocin, and he starts describing about how important oxytocin is. But now we're not just one step removed from DHT, now we're 2 steps removed from it. He's talking about a hormone influenced by a metabolite of DHT, but again, he's never even shown that finasteride or dutasteride even affect DHT in the brain to begin with, let alone androstenediol levels or oxytocin levels. This is literally him just speculating about something that is already speculative to begin with. He's presenting all these studies, but without showing us any actual link between these mechanisms and taking finasteride or dutasteride, then this whole segment of his video is a great big nothing burger. We're not rodents. Nobody cares about any of this shit. Please talk about something that's actually important.
In addition, here's a study that showed that 3-alpha and 3-beta androstenediol had cognitive enhancing and anxiolytic effects in rats. But the study concluded that these effects were mediated by estrogen receptor beta, but I don't think that's very accurate.
Okay, he's still talking about the downstream effects of DHT metabolites in rats. Big surprise. But this time, since the results of the study don't confirm his biases, he just throws them out the window completely and imposes his own interpretation as if he knows better than the actual researchers. My stance on this is that none of this fucking matters whatsoever anyways, since we're talking about rat studies, but if you're going to hold rat studies in higher regard than I do, then you don't get to pick and choose which ones are correct based on what your priors are. This is an incredibly disingenuous way to present your research.
Now let's talk about Allopregnanolone, which is a neurosteroid that doesn't bind to any steroid receptors, but it does have GABA A positive allosteric modulation as its primary effect. Like, again, that's like your Xanax, your Klonopin, your Valium, etc. But it also has different effects on the brain that are not completely understood. So let's start by how it's inhibited. Basically, when you inhibit 5-alpha reductase, you inhibit the conversion of progesterone into 5-alpha dihydroprogesterone, and 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase is what turns 5-alpha dihydroprogesterone into allopregnanolone. So the synthesis of allopregnanolone is inhibited by dutasteride, and I'm going to get to the importance of allopregnanolone in the brain.
But my neurosteroids! I knew it was only a matter of time before he played the allopregnanolone card. To his credit though, he actually does get something right here. Take a look at this screenshot. This is what a lot of DHT simps stubbornly refuse to admit, and that is the fact that allopregnanolone is a paracrine hormone of the brain that is synthesized by the type 1 5-air isoenzyme, not the type 2 5-air isoenzyme that finasteride blocks. That means that just like DHT, allopregnanolone is active where it is produced, but the important thing to remember here, chooms, is that it is the type 1 5-air isoenzyme that produces allopregnanolone in the brain, which finasteride, of course, has no significant effect on. I don't know how many times I have to keep on repeating this. He actually says that it is dutasteride, but not finasteride, which affects allopregnanolone levels in the brain. However, even though dutasteride is 100 times stronger at inhibiting the type 1 isoenzyme than finasteride is, the effect of dutasteride on allopregnanolone levels still appears to be pretty damn weak. Dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day had no effect on serum allopregnanolone levels whatsoever, although 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride per day did have a slight effect. However, keep in mind, we're just talking about serum allopregnanolone levels here. There's no evidence that dutasteride affects brain allopregnanolone levels or causes any neurological side effects whatsoever, which may have something to do with the fact that dutasteride is a bigger molecule than finasteride, so it doesn't effectively cross the blood-brain barrier. But if dutasteride, which is 100 times stronger than finasteride, only barely has an effect on serum allopregnanolone levels when it is used at 5 times the higher dose than the standard dose, What chance does finasteride have of affecting allopregnanolone levels? It doesn't seem like its chances are very good, chumps. There is no good evidence whatsoever that finasteride inhibits allopregnanolone levels in the brain, and I've covered this in many videos ad nauseum, which I'll link below. Anyways, let's see where he's going with this whole allopregnanolone topic.
And I'm gonna get to the importance of allopregnanolone in the brain.
Almost a Doctor next goes through some studies on the effects of allopregnanolone in the brain, but really, none of this matters. The 5-AR blockers that are used clinically haven't shown to affect brain allopregnanolone levels to any significant degree, so none of this research even matters. He's presenting all this like it's a settled conclusion that 5-AR inhibitors affect allopregnanolone levels, but they don't. In fact, even Almost a Doctor admits that finasteride doesn't affect allopregnanolone synthesis in the brain, so I don't get why this guy is being such a damn asshole to me. We're actually in agreement here, at least on this one point.
Now, I know this study was done on rats, but most of the studies done on rats work in humans.
No, Einstein, rat studies do not work on humans, at least not when we're talking about 5-AR inhibitors. For the millionth time, rodents do not metabolize finasteride the same way humans do. He says rodent data can be extrapolated to humans, but he's just flat out wrong about that point. These drugs work differently in these two organisms, so how is this rat data relevant? Almost a Doctor shows us all these rat studies, and then he just expects us to take it on faith that these studies also apply to humans. No, they don't. 5-AR inhibitors work differently in rodent brains compared to human brains, so the only way for you to prove your point here would be to show us actual human data. So stop wasting our time and show us some relevant data.
So to say that, oh, it's just a study done on rats, it doesn't reflect reality, stop being fucking arrogant.
No, it's not arrogant to request better data. Basically, what I'm hearing you say right now is, oh, we've got some rodent data that says finasteride's bad for the brain. Oh, you disagree with me? Well, fuck you then. No, science doesn't work that way. Saccharin is an artificial sweetener that literally causes cancer in rats, yet it is still commonly found in many soft drinks, and that is because it isn't known to cause cancer in human beings. There may be some cases where rat data can be extrapolated to humans, but you always have to confirm it with human data first. That's all I'm asking you to do here.
Sorry for the change in scenery, I had to go run an errand.
More like he had to take a break so he can find more rat studies, am I right?
You cannot say that this is nothing and that the synthesis of this hormone is just bullshit by the body, and inhibiting its synthesis is gonna do nothing to your psychology, not short term nor long term. That's just stupid. That's just wrong.
It's not stupid and it's not wrong to request that you validate weaker data with stronger data. That's how science works. Considering we know for a fact that rodents respond differently to 5-AR inhibitors than humans do, it is very reasonable to ask that you prove that this rodent data is applicable to humans. It's not though, because humans respond differently to finasteride than rodents do. Simple as that.
And finasteride and dutasteride inhibited dopaminergic response with both of these drugs. So much so that this paper suggested that 5-alpha reductase could be a novel target in the treatment of schizophrenia and other neuropsychiatric disorders. So yeah, these drugs seem to act like antipsychotics. And to say that this is nothing and it's also just irrelevant and it's all in people's heads when they say they feel depressed on them, that shit is fucking wild of anybody to say.
Well, he says finasteride has antipsychotic effects as if that's a bad thing. He then tries to link these antipsychotic effects to people claiming that they get depressed on finasteride, but antipsychotic effects are not the same thing as depressive effects. So this is a non sequitur argument, but that's even assuming we accept that this study is valid. It isn't. It is yet another goddamn rat study. Furthermore, it is a rat study that applies specifically to the brain, even though rodent brains do not respond to finasteride the same way human brains do. I don't need to explain why again, you guys already know.
So as for Post-Finasteride Syndrome, this hair cafe clown was trying to say it doesn't exist, it's all nocebo, it's in their heads, and there's no scientific evidence that it's real. Well, number one, there is fucking scientific evidence that it's real. Number two, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction was thought to be a fake condition and it's all in their heads and it's all nocebo until it was studied properly and evidence has shown itself.
So I'm just going to go ahead and ignore his personal attacks. I mean, I don't need to stoop to his level here because I know the evidence is on my side. So let's address the 2 points he makes here. First off, yes, it is possible to find studies that claim to support the idea that post-finasteride syndrome is real. There are doctors that have even made a career out of it, like Dr. Trash and Dr. Earwig. The problem with the research is that it is all plagued by massive selection bias issues where the subjects in the study are people who are recruited from anti-finasteride organizations like the PFS Foundation and the PFS Network. If you design a study about finasteride with the intention of making finasteride look bad, you can easily do that. You just have to recruit people who already have a negative opinion about finasteride. The type of study you would actually have to do in order to prove that post-finasteride syndrome does exist would have to be a large prospective randomized trial where none of the subjects knew whether they were getting finasteride or a placebo treatment. Of course, that type of study has already been done. It was back when finasteride was first clinically evaluated by the FDA, and those studies showed no evidence of any kind of post-finasteride syndrome. Secondly, as for SSRIs, I'm pretty much a layman on that subject. Personally speaking, I have used SSRIs in the past, and I did not have a good experience with them. But none of that matters, because SSRIs are not the same thing as 5-AR inhibitors. So you can't take data about Zoloft and Paxil, for instance, and say that this also applies to Propecia or Avodart. These drugs are not even in the same category. It would be like comparing statins to anti-inflammatory drugs. I think the point he's trying to make here is that since post-SSRI syndrome is taken seriously today, that means that post-finasteride syndrome will eventually be taken seriously as well. I mean, I think it's debatable whether or not post-SSRI syndrome is really a universally accepted reality, but even if it is, we're not talking about the same category of drugs here. In fact, I think that maybe to some degree, post-finasteride syndrome may have been inspired by post-SSRI syndrome because it was reported first, but I'm of course just speculating here. It doesn't matter though, because there is no data linking the two syndromes together or even confirming post-finasteride syndrome to exist to begin with. I don't really care about SSRIs. This is a hair loss channel, not a depression channel, so SSRIs are not even germane to the focus of my content, so I will say no more about them.
So, in post-finasteride syndrome, there's altered levels of neurosteroids in the cerebrospinal fluid, and there's epigenetic changes of the SRD5A2 gene in the cerebrospinal fluid. That's the gene that encodes for 5-alpha reductase type 2, and we can deduce that it's malfunctioning because they do have lower DHT concentrations in their cerebrospinal fluid.
But my epigenetics! So, to support his claims about post-finasteride syndrome being real, he brings up several articles. The first one is this one here. The study is based on a grand total of 7 subjects complaining of sexual dysfunction and depression. And these subjects were recruited from the, quote, Italian network finasteride side effects, unquote. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be no selection bias issues from an organization like that. Anyways, the results of the spinal fluid were compared to the spinal fluid of 12 healthy control subjects. The post-finasteride syndrome subjects had been off finasteride for between 171 and 5,000 days, and on average had been on finasteride for about 2 years. The study doesn't say how many of these men had symptoms that started while on finasteride or whether they started long after stopping the drug. After all, 5,000 days is a long time. That's about 13 and a half years we're talking about here, chums. The study did show differences in neurosteroid levels in the spinal fluid of the depressed subjects versus the healthy subjects, but the results aren't as striking or consistent as almost a doctor would have you believe. If you look at this figure here, you can see the different measurements they made. CSF stands for cerebral spinal fluid in the figure. You could see that the spinal fluid DHT was lower in the PFS subjects than the control subjects, but the plasma DHT was actually higher in the PFS subjects than in the control subjects. Also, the 2 enzymes that almost a doctor has been claiming for the last 10 minutes are great for you, specifically 3-alpha androstenediol and 3-beta androstenediol, are actually increased in the PFS subjects compared to controls. Pretty ironic, wouldn't you think? So, the problem with this study, like most post-finasteride syndrome studies, is that they use healthy control subjects for comparison. They didn't use men with similar symptoms who had never taken finasteride like they should have if they really wanted this to be a valid study. It is a well-known scientific fact that neurosteroids are altered in subjects with major depressive disorder and with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Altered neurosteroid levels are markers of depression and can even be used to diagnose depression. So basically, These test results, all they do is just confirm that the subjects had depression. That's it. It doesn't address the cause of the depression. For all we know, these men were depressed because they were losing their hair. All this study confirms is that the subjects had depression, which is a very common condition, of course. It doesn't confirm that finasteride actually caused their depression. Again, the type of study you would need in order to do to confirm that finasteride was the cause of these subjects' depression would have to be a study that compares subjects with depression who had never taken finasteride to subjects with depression who had taken finasteride. The study would have to show that there was some specific differences between the results in the two groups in order to show that finasteride was causing depression by a different mechanism than what normally happens to everyone who has depression. Also, I have to say that the main author of the study, Dr. Roberto Cosimo Melcangi, deserves a place of honor in the Hair Cafe cinematic universe because he has published essentially the same article using the same data 3 different times over for a 4-year period. If it seems there are a lot of post-finasteride syndrome papers in the medical literature, you are right, because the literature is literally flooded with small, repetitive studies from just a small handful of investigators like Dr. Melcangi. So, post-finasteride syndrome believers are relying on Brandolini's law. They're just trying to flood the internet with so much of the same bullshit that everyone just gets completely overwhelmed and doesn't even attempt to refute it. So, besides this neurosteroid article, Almost a Doctor also mentions this study here. It's on altered methylation patterns of the SRD5A2 gene in the spinal fluid of post-finasteride syndrome patients, also written by, you guessed it, Dr. Melcangi. I'm telling you, Dr. Melcangi, I think he's trying to compete with Dr. Trash and Dr. Earwig as the most prolific anti-finasteride doctor on the internet. By this time, Dr. Melcangi has managed to find 16 subjects recruited from the Italian network of finasteride side effects to have spinal taps, but he can only round up 18 control subjects this time. The investigators look at the presence or absence of methylation of the SRD5A1 and SRD5A2 genes, which are the genes for the type 1 and the type 2 5-air isoenzymes. Methylation is a type of epigenetic change that can inactivate the function of these genes. So, the investigators found methylation of the SRD5A2 gene in 9 out of 16 PFS subjects and in 1 out of 13 control subjects. So this was a statistically significant difference, but obviously the number of subjects here is very small. However, even if this difference was real, it is another case where it is impossible to say if finasteride had anything to do with any of these changes. As the investigators themselves correctly point out, quote, presently, it is impossible to establish whether the SRD5A2 methylation pattern in PFF subjects is set during early embryo development or results from finasteride treatment itself, unquote. It is impossible to blame finasteride because epigenetic changes can occur from embryonic development all the way into old age, and at least in rat studies, rats with these epigenetic variations are more predisposed to depression and anxiety to begin with. So even Dr. Melcangi, who is an all-the-way doctor instead of an almost a doctor, is forced to admit in the conclusion to the rat study that, quote, whether this epigenetic pattern is established prenatally or induced by finasteride treatment cannot be concluded, unquote.
And in rats, long-term treatment with finasteride and dutasteride resulted in reduced neurosteroid concentrations in their cerebral cortex and hippocampus and fucking cerebellum. So to say that there's no way this could translate to humans whatsoever in any case is fucking stupid.
Then, after he accuses everyone who disagrees with him of being fucking stupid, he proceeds to bring up another worthless rat study, and yet again, this is from Dr. Melcangi. It really makes me wonder how Dr. Melcangi feels about this shitty ideologue abusing his work like this. I imagine he can't be too happy. Anyways, this study looked at giving rats a dose of finasteride of 3 milligrams per kilogram per day for 20 days. As expected, serum DHT levels decreased on finasteride, but DHT levels in the brain and cerebral spinal fluid actually were not affected at all. The investigators actually concluded that finasteride had no effect on the levels of 5-AR substrates or products in the brains of male rats, but only affected peripheral DHT production. So far, so good. However, specifically in the cerebral cortex, the only significant change during finasteride treatment was a decrease in DHEA levels. This doesn't make a lot of sense to me since production of DHEA does not depend on the 5-AR enzyme. It's also strange to me that in the cerebellum, finasteride treatment caused the dihydroprogesterone levels to go up, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense since dihydroprogesterone is a product of the 5-AR enzyme which is blocked by finasteride. So basically, there are generally a lot of variation in the measured neurosteroid neurosteroid levels between the finasteride and the control groups, and some of the changes were statistically significant while other changes were not. The same thing was seen after withdrawal of finasteride. Mechanistically, not all the changes could have arisen just from a 5-hour blockade, and so the authors propose that some other effects of finasteride must be going on here. However, I think there is a much simpler explanation. The study was based on an extremely small number of rats. For most of the analyses, the number of finasteride and control rats was just 8, and in some analyses, just 5 rats were used in each group. So I guess Dr. Mokanji's rat budget is pretty limited. Maybe the price of rats in Italy is really high, I don't know. Anyways, given the fact that some of the findings don't make sense mechanistically, as well as the fact that this was a very small rat study, I think it's pretty unlikely that the results here would be reproducible. Also, like I said before a million times already, you cannot extrapolate rat data to humans. I don't know why this is such a hard concept for DHT simps to grasp. Rat brains do not metabolize finasteride the same way as human brains. That's kind of a big deal when it comes to research, chums.
Not only that, but there's evidence of abnormal somatosensory evoked potentials in the pudendal nerves of people suffering post-finasteride syndrome. So the pudendal nerve is the nerve that supplies your pubic area, including your fucking genitals.
So he's talking about this study, which has this acknowledgement at the bottom. We thank the Post-Finasteride Syndrome for the financial support to R.C. Mokanji. No conflict of interest there, right, chums? Here, Dr. Mokanji is probably using the same 16 PFS subjects that are in all of his studies. All of them had symptoms of erectile dysfunction. But of these 16 cherry-picked subjects, only 4 had abnormal pudendal nerve testing, and in 3 of those cases, the response was not reproducible. So that leaves 1 out of 16 with a definite pudendal nerve abnormality. However, it turns out that pudendal nerve abnormalities are very common in young men with erectile dysfunction, as shown in this paper here. Organic causes of erectile dysfunction are present in 5 to 72% of men with erectile dysfunction who are younger than 40 years, and pudendal nerve abnormalities are the primary cause. So it turns out that erectile dysfunction is actually common in young men, and organic causes involving the pudendal nerve are common as well. So tell me, chums, how does a study of pudendal nerve function in post-finasteride syndrome subjects show that finasteride was the cause of their problems? Spoiler alert, it doesn't!
And if that wasn't enough, there's abnormal findings on MRIs of the brains of patients suffering from post-finasteride syndrome in the centers responsible for sexual behavior, depression, anxiety.
So finally, we get to a paper that is not by Dr. Mokanji. It's this one here. And actually, it turns out that this is a paper that refutes the notion that post-finasteride syndrome has an organic cause. The study found no evidence of androgen deficiency, 5-AR inhibition, or diminished peripheral androgen action in men complaining of post-finasteride syndrome symptoms. What the researchers found was evidence of MRI brain activity that was consistent with what is normally seen in men with sexual dysfunction and depression. So there is no evidence that any of these problems were caused by finasteride. What is consistent, though, with all these studies is that men complaining of post-finasteride syndrome are depressed and they have sexual dysfunction. Whether they're depressed because of their erectile dysfunction or because they are going bald is anyone's guess, of course, but there is still not a shred of evidence linking their symptoms to the fact that they once took finasteride, sometimes many years in the past. Remember, symptoms like erectile dysfunction and depression are highly multifactorial, so it is a tremendous stretch to just jump to the conclusion that finasteride caused all these problems. You need much better research in order to qualify that claim. There is enough spontaneous depression and erectile dysfunction in young people to explain all the symptoms of everyone claiming to have post-finasteride syndrome. Finasteride is just a convenient excuse and scapegoat that allows people to join forums and wallow in each other's misery.
And critics desperately want to say that, well, the MRI findings are irrelevant because more than half of these people already had pre-existing psychiatric conditions. Number one, there was no evidence they had the same MRI findings before, so that's reason for question.
So he's referring to this article here that showed that 57% of men with post-finasteride syndrome had a pre-existing psychiatric condition and 18% had a family history of psychiatric conditions. So This is actually strong evidence that post-finasteride syndrome is not related to finasteride. Rather, it is just a consequence of a pre-existing psychiatric disorder. But Almost a Doctor just blows this off, and he says there's no evidence they had the same MRI findings before. But what does that even mean? Is he talking about before they took finasteride, before they developed symptoms? Clearly, the article is just saying the MRI findings are consistent with sexual dysfunction and depression. The burden of proof is still on Almost a Doctor to show that these findings are due to finasteride, but he can't. Sorry, Almost a Doctor, despite this masculinity grift you're giving us here, you have utterly failed to make your case. But there are still about 5 minutes left in this video, so you still have a chance to redeem yourself, so let's listen to him continue to rant.
Number two, it could be interpreted in different ways, one of which is that we all react differently to the modern sedentary lifestyles and shitty diets, and it's not crazy to think that some people could have impaired recovery from drugs, because we know that people can have mental illness issues based on diet.
So this part of the video is barely worth covering even, since it is just pure speculation on his part, but it does still raise a pretty interesting question. If you think people are having mental health issues just based on their diet, then maybe that could be an alternative explanation for the mental health issues that post-finasteride syndrome subjects complain about instead of their finasteride use. I mean, just think about this for a second. Your average post-finasteride syndrome sufferer has a diet that consists almost entirely of Mountain Dew, Doritos, Cheetos, and Hot Pockets, and the last time they even exercised was when they played Wii Sports back in 2006. So Almost a Doctor may actually have a point here, but it still doesn't prove any connection between finasteride and depression. But I would still be inclined to agree that the shitty lifestyle many PFS people live may be making their mental health worse, but it has nothing to do with finasteride, of course.
From the progress we see in mental illness on carnivore diets, for example, or even ketogenic diets, just that, or even Paul Saladino's diet, so on and so forth. So to want to discredit the whole group of people based on their past is stupid, biased, and just flat out ascientific.
So I don't really know what his point is here. I guess he's implying that you can cure depressive symptoms if you go on the carnivore diet. Maybe that's what his business is all about, but he doesn't back up his claims with any scientific evidence, and frankly, this whole point seems like a big red herring, so let's just go ahead and move on.
If peripheral neuropathy of the pudendal nerve wasn't enough, and the MRI findings wasn't enough, the cerebrospinal fluid abnormalities weren't enough.
No, Almost a Doctor, it's not enough. You're going to have to do a lot better if you want to actually prove that post-finasteride syndrome is real.
Here's a study that looked at the epigenetic changes in the penile skin of patients suffering post-finasteride syndrome, as well as a control group. In addition, they studied the androgen receptor density in those areas. In patients with post-finasteride syndrome, 1,466 genes were overexpressed and 2,318 genes were underexpressed. So there's clearly something going on if fucking genes are over and underexpressed in their penile skin.
So after ranting and making weird speculation about the ketogenic and carnivore diet, he mentions this article right here. And look at this. I thought it looked familiar, and that's because it is. It's an article I covered in its entirety in a separate video titled Post-Finasteride Syndrome is a Conspiracy Theory, and I'll link that video below. I've actually covered this paper many times in other videos as well, but what this is the infamous Baylor study that not even the anti-finasteride crowd takes seriously anymore, which is why they almost never talk about it these days. The study was authored by Dr. Mohit Kira, who is a quack urologist who got absolutely wrecked by Chad Dr. Peter Attia, and I reviewed that interview in a video which I'll link below. So go ahead and check it out if you want to see how clueless this doctor is. But anyways, this study looked at gene expression in 26 men complaining of post-finasteride syndrome symptoms and compared them to 26 control subjects with no health complaints. The study found 1,446 genes overexpressed and 2,318 genes underexpressed in the post-finasteride syndrome subjects. So this was sort of a fishing expedition here. This is where the investigators just looked at over 24,000 genes and noted where there were differences between the control and post-finasteride syndrome groups. Most of the genetic differences just don't seem to have anything to do with finasteride. For example, the most upregulated gene was the gene for skin development, and the most downregulated gene was the gene for blood vessel development. Most of these differences differences just reflect the fact that the study group and the control group were not comparable. For example, the control group was older and had a higher BMI than the finasteride group, and the testosterone level was higher in the post-finasteride syndrome group. Also, the study was so sloppy that they didn't even measure the serum DHT in the control group. I mean, just think about that for a second. This is a study about finasteride's effects on the human body that doesn't even measure finasteride's primary effect on the human body, which is lowering DHT levels. And of course, the groups weren't even comparable to begin with because one group had erectile dysfunction and depression and the control group didn't. When is someone going to do a study comparing finasteride users with depression and erectile dysfunction to people with the same symptoms who never took finasteride? How hard would it be to actually do that? All these other studies are really just a complete waste of time. Also, there is no before and after finasteride comparison of the gene data, so it is completely impossible to know if these differences were just inherent differences in the study population versus the control group that were totally unrelated to the use of finasteride. There are many other problems with this study as well, but again, I went over all this in more detail in the other videos I mentioned, which you of course can review yourself in the description, so let's go ahead and move on.
So to say that it's impossible for this to happen later because finasteride has a half-life of fucking 5 to 6 hours is stupid. If you don't know what you're talking about, just shut the fuck up and let people who do know talk. Leave the talking to the grown-ups.
Yeah, you should probably take your own advice there, dickhead. You don't even know how to interpret studies beyond their conclusion and abstract.
Now, as for total rates of side effects from these drugs, I'm gonna link a paper here, but I'm not gonna explain it because the video will be too long, on how these side effects could have been underreported in these studies on finasteride and benign prostatic hyperplasia especially. Basically, let me tell you this. In the studies of benign prostatic hyperplasia and the Propecia studies, the side effects being reported were all subjective. There were no real tests done.
Yes, that's what a side effect is, genius. Side effects are inherently subjective. What almost a doctor is implying here is that subjects in these trials had side effects that they weren't aware of. But that doesn't make sense. And if you had a side effect you couldn't feel, how would that even be a side effect? It's not a side effect unless it is actually noticed by the person taking the drug. He's saying that there were a bunch of side effects in the clinical trials that weren't detected during these trials, but what he's actually talking about here is not side effects at all, but rather objective testing in order to evaluate the effects of finasteride on things like erectile quality, mood, and cognitive function. That was not the purpose of the original clinical trials, but there have been decades of subsequent follow-up research conducted independently that have not shown any effects of these drugs on mental health. Due to the threat of litigation, Merck did eventually agree to add depression and prolonged side effects to the package insert. But even the FDA stated that there was no evidence of any of this being real, and it certainly wasn't justified. The only reason Merck even added this warning to the package insert was in hopes of fending off litigation, but it ended up backfiring spectacularly and failing miserably. It's especially interesting how dutasteride has never had these warnings added to the package insert, despite the fact that it is a more potent 5-AR inhibitor than finasteride. It is painfully obvious that post-finasteride syndrome is not a real condition. It is a social media phenomenon that is amplified by online hysteria that is promoted by profit-based organizations whose existence is contingent on people believing that finasteride side effects are permanent.
Let's say the majority of people don't feel side effects, right? That's what's implied in the data. Okay, I agree with that. But to say that just because the majority don't feel side effects, that means the people who do feel actual side effects are only like fucking 4% or whatever, and it's impossible to be this many, and there's a nocebo effect going on. Well, okay, why does this effect not happen with fucking ibuprofen and acetaminophen or blood pressure medications?
The first part of this argument is a straw man because nobody is arguing that finasteride side effects aren't real. My argument is that permanent side effects after stopping finasteride aren't possible. The second point he makes is that the side effects people experience can't be nocebo, but we have clinical evidence that proves his claim is false. First of all, the nocebo effect is just as real as the placebo effect. It affects literally all clinical trials, including for the drugs he mentions, like painkillers. Secondly, Secondly, there is clear evidence of a nocebo effect when people take finasteride. In this classic study I have mentioned many times before, subjects who are informed of possible sexual side effects of finasteride before starting the drug had a much higher incidence of sexual side effects than subjects who weren't informed about them. So the nocebo effect is definitely a real thing, and it affects literally all drugs. There is no way this guy could have gone to medical school and not known this, so maybe he hasn't had this course yet, but I remember even being taught about placebo and nocebo effects back in high school, and I went to high school back in the 90s, so this is a really amateurish take from almost a doctor here.
Why is this so exclusive to finasteride and dutasteride?
It's not, dipshit. Try again.
Why do people feel brain fog? Why do people feel depressed? Why do people feel anxious? Why do people feel like even a slight loss in libido?
Because of a nocebo effect. This is all clinically verified. If you want to claim it isn't a nocebo effect, the burden of proof is on you, and you're going to have to do a little better than rat studies next time.
And is it realistic to say that if you take these medications and you don't feel side effects, that you still might be having side effects that are just so minute that you don't notice them and you don't care about them and in your life just don't affect you that much? It's very realistic.
Well, sure, I guess it's theoretically possible, but practically speaking, if side effects are so minor that you don't even notice them, are they really even side effects at all? Why should I give a damn if it's too minor for me to even notice? If someone has a 1% drop in their libido level, they're probably not going to notice it at all, and if they don't notice it, then who gives a shit?
In addition, a lot of these people that are actually on finasteride now, those who don't participate in the study or whatever the fuck, they are obsessed with their hair, okay? Hair loss causes them way more stress than a loss of neurosteroids does, okay? So they probably feel fucking better on finasteride and dutasteride because of the whole hair loss cure thing.
Okay, well then wouldn't that mean that people who are obsessed with their hair would be much more likely to feel depressed if they lost their hair? Wouldn't that help explain the situation of people who have to stop taking finasteride because of side effects, whether the side effects are real or imagined? If someone is taking finasteride because of hair loss, then that proves that hair obviously matters to them. So if they can't use finasteride and then they lose their hair as a consequence of that, wouldn't that hair loss explain their depression and prolonged side effects, especially since by its very nature, depression is a prolonged effect. So even though this guy is a toxic asshole, I think he may have just figured out post-finasteride syndrome. What happens is people stop taking finasteride. They then lose their hair as a consequence of that, and then they get prolonged depression because, let's face it, hair loss is really fucking depressing, and we know it matters to these people, otherwise they never would have started finasteride to begin with. And it doesn't just stop there, chums, because guess what depression can also cause? That's right, it can also cause erectile dysfunction. So, congratulations, not a doctor. You've provided a perfect explanation for post-finasteride syndrome. Let's move on.
Okay, which, look, I take finasteride myself to protect my hair and my prostate, okay? So, I understand.
So, this is a pretty interesting plot twist. A finasteride user who hates finasteride? He's kind of like a vegan who eats meat.
To go and blame the people who do feel side effects is fucking stupid. Especially because these studies were not actually done on people who are athletic and not inflamed at all. They were done on pretty much general population, buddy.
And the studies you mentioned weren't even done on people at all. They were done on rats, yet you have more faith in that research than the actual clinical trials done on finasteride. We don't know the lifestyle or background of every subject who was in the clinical trials, but there were thousands of them, so most likely there were people who were athletes, people who were moderately active, as well as people who were just couch potatoes. When you have a large enough sample size, then these limitations are accounted for. And again, we're talking about thousands of subjects. So this is a complete non-issue.
So these people are most likely eating just whatever diets, and whatever diets cause inflammation.
You can make the same argument for diet. There were thousands of people in the clinical trials, so they probably had all sorts of different diets. There were probably people who ate a standard American diet, people who had a Mediterranean diet. There may have been vegans, vegetarians, or people following a low-carb diet. These weren't measured for in the subjects, but it doesn't matter in the slightest because the sample size had thousands of subjects. So it's just wrong to say that these studies excluded athletic people or people on specific diets. And why would that have made a difference anyways. There is no evidence that shows that finasteride has a greater side effect profile depending on your diet or activity level. Being sedentary and eating a shitty diet probably can cause depression and erectile dysfunction, but it can do that on its own without finasteride. But when you have a very large sample size, these differences aren't important.
You are a fucking idiot, and that goes to the Hair Cafe idiot as well. This guy has a pretty respectable platform and he's using it to spread misinformation. And I think it's just because he's stupid, but also because he wants attention. Really. He's stupid, like I said.
I think I'm going to go ahead and just ignore these ad hominem attacks, but I think it's still worth mentioning that what I'm saying on this channel is just the scientific consensus. Everything I have ever said in my videos about persistent side effects, the nocebo effect, neurological side effects, etc., that's not some idea I just invented or pulled out of my ass one day. That's all backed by strong scientific evidence. So, if this guy resents me for it, then he resents the majority opinion of most doctors and researchers too. I know this because the majority of doctors do not believe post-finasteride syndrome is a real condition, and I have a video which proves this, which I'll go ahead and link below. But I'm nevertheless glad that this guy is showing his true colors here, because he's showing just how damn toxic the whole post-finasteride syndrome community is, and why they'll never be taken seriously by the medical or scientific community at large. They have no interest in honest discourse. They just want to tear down and destroy everyone who disagrees with them by any means necessary. Those are the tactics of a cult, not a serious scientific community.
And he's looking for the data that he wants to confirm his bias that DHT is a hormone that we evolved by accident or God gave us by accident. It's all just a stupid joke for men to lose their hair and nothing good comes from it and you should just flatline it to zero and it's stupid and it does nothing. Whatever, man, whatever.
Yet another strawman argument. I'd never said that DHT is completely useless. When I say it is a trash hormone, I'm talking about in the context of adulthood. Even in my very first video about DHT being a trash hormone, I made the case that DHT plays important roles in utero and during early adolescent development, but in adulthood, it ceases being useful and only causes problems. That's why suppressing it in adulthood produces such positive health outcomes, such as stopping hair loss, stopping prostate enlargement, and stopping acne, and that's just scraping the surface here, chums. There is strong scientific evidence that finasteride is associated with reduced risk of mortality from various diseases, like heart disease and even cancer, and I cover that in a lot of previous videos, including my videos on Brian Johnson, which I'll link below.
I'm saying, if it doesn't affect your quality of life to crush this hormone, go do it. If it saves your hair, fucking great, go do it. It's probably going to save you from prostate cancer also. But to say that it's the same for everybody and it can't affect your quality of life and it can't give you post-finasteride syndrome, God forbid, that's fucking dumb.
No, it isn't dumb. What is dumb, though, is overstating the risk of finasteride and discouraging the majority of people from wanting to try it, and thus dooming them to a lifetime of being a sexless slaphead when chances are they would have responded just fine to treatment if they actually tried it. Videos like this serve no other purpose but to gaslight finasteride and make otherwise good responders to the drug too fearful to even try it. I help people overcome their fears about finasteride because I know 5-AR inhibitors are safe and they are the best thing we have to stop hair loss in the long term, so nobody should resent me from calling out the bullshit people like you try to spread.
That's fucking stupid. Anyway, like, subscribe, and if you have post-finasteride syndrome or know anybody with post-finasteride syndrome, I can fucking cure it. I have a protocol that works and it's worked in the past. So send them my way or come my way. Talk to your doctor first, right? So, like, subscribe, check out my website. Goodbye.
Well, that explains a lot now, doesn't it? So now we really know why he wants you to believe that post-finasteride syndrome is real. It's because he charges a service to help cure you from it. This guy is an absolute grifter, and I'm willing to bet you anything that his cure probably involves something pseudoscientific and based on no evidence whatsoever, like following a carnivore or ketogenic diet, or maybe he'll recommend some pseudo-nootropic substance that is backed by a couple of rodent studies at best. I don't know for sure, but this at least proves that he does have a financial interest in you believing that post-finasteride syndrome is real. The more people who believe in it, the more likely people may be desperate enough to pay him money for his cure whatever the fuck that may be. I guess that also explains why he's so damn pissed off at me, even though I've never done a thing to this guy. By proving that post-finasteride syndrome is bullshit, as I often do on this channel, I'm hurting his business and his bottom line. But my practical advice to him would be to find another line of work, not just because what he's doing is unethical, but also because he's not qualified. He describes himself on his website as a, quote, grade A medical student, almost a doctor, unquote. But if he really had a medical background, he would never be making claims that he can cure people. There are people who are real doctors, who have heavily researched post-finasteride syndrome, much more so than this guy. People who are infinitely more qualified than this ass clown, and even they would never claim that they can actually cure post-finasteride syndrome. I bet you anything that even anti-finasteride doctors like Dr. Trash, Dr. Earwig, or even Dr. Melkanji, who this guy references several times, would tell you that he's completely full of shit. So, almost a doctor or whoever the fuck you are, you need to pull the stick out of your ass and get a fucking life. You are not welcome to comment on my channel, and I'm never responding to you ever again. So fuck you and God bless.